Hey guys, tonight we begin with volcanoes. Not the fun vacation volcanoes with gift shops and overpriced mugs. Not the little cone-shaped mountains that politely puff smoke every few decades just to remind everyone they exist. No. Tonight we are talking about the enormous ones, the ancient supervolcanoes that erupted with such ridiculous force that they darkened skies, froze summers, buried forests, and casually rearranged the emotional stability of entire civilizations. So dim the lights. Maybe grab a blanket. Try not to think too hard about the molten rock quietly existing under the planet right now. And let's drift together into the long, strange history of Earth occasionally, deciding it has absolutely had enough. Because humans love pretending we are in charge. We build palaces. We crown kings. We invent taxes for some reason. And then every once in a while, the Earth opens a giant flaming hole in the crust and reminds everybody that we are essentially nervous little mammals living on a warm shell over liquid chaos. Which is humbling and honestly a bit rude. Our journey tonight starts long before modern nations, long before castles, long before historians with powdered wigs argued over maps in dusty libraries. We begin in a prehistoric world where early humans wandered through harsh landscapes carrying spears, surviving mostly through stubbornness and luck. And unfortunately for them, luck was about to take a brief vacation. Around 74,000 years ago, on the island of Sumatra, in what is now Indonesia, a supervolcano called Toba erupted with a level of violence that sounds fake even when scientists explain it carefully. The eruption was so large that modern volcanologists still talk about it in slightly exhausted tones, like people remembering an especially destructive relative at Thanksgiving dinner. Toba did not simply explode. It emptied itself. Thousands of cubic kilometers of ash and magma blasted upward into the atmosphere. Entire mountain ranges effectively collapsed inward. The sky darkened. Ash drifted across continents. Temperatures dropped worldwide. Imagine waking up every day beneath a gray sky while crops fail and sunlight becomes more of a suggestion than a reality. Very cozy. Very relaxing. Excellent conditions for emotional well-being. Scientists still debate exactly how devastating the aftermath became, but many believe the eruption may have caused a volcanic winter lasting years. Some theories suggest humanity itself was pushed frighteningly close to extinction, which is honestly incredible when you think about it. Every annoying modern argument online, every royal family disaster, every awkward office meeting, every man who has ever started a podcast about alpha male discipline. All of it may exist because a few thousand frightened humans somehow survived after the sky basically broke. And those survivors lived hard lives. The landscapes after Toba would have looked grim beyond description. Forests struggled. Animals migrated or died. Rivers changed. Ash coated enormous stretches of land. The air itself would have felt hostile. Early humans were already balancing on the edge of survival. They had no cities, no emergency food reserves, no weather forecasts, no comforting social media posts explaining that we're all in this together. Just cold winds and uncertainty, and yet somehow they endured. There is something oddly calming about that. Human beings have survived astonishing disasters while wearing little more than animal skins and bad expressions. Modern civilization feels permanent because we surround ourselves with concrete and glowing screens. But ancient humans understood something we often forget. Nature is not stable. The world is not designed for comfort. Sometimes the planet simply decides to fling ash into the stratosphere and everybody else adapts or disappears. And speaking of disappearing, let's gently float over to another civilization that had the deeply unfortunate experience of building an entire society near a ticking geological nightmare. This brings us to the ancient Aegean Sea and the beautiful island of Thera, now known as Santorini. Today, Santorini is famous for white buildings, blue roofs, and couples spending unreasonable amounts of money on honeymoon photos. But thousands of years ago, it was home to a thriving Bronze Age civilization connected to the mysterious and wealthy Minoan civilization. The Minoans were sophisticated traders. They built elegant cities. They created colorful frescoes full of dolphins and flowers and people who somehow all looked calmer than anyone alive today. They had plumbing systems before many medieval kings managed to figure out basic hygiene. A surprisingly advanced society. And unfortunately, they lived next to a volcano with catastrophic ambitions. Around 1600 years before the birth of Jesus Christ, Thera erupted in one of the largest volcanic events in recorded human history. The explosion shattered much of the island. Entire towns vanished beneath ash and debris. Massive tsunamis slammed into surrounding coastlines. Trade networks collapsed. Ports were destroyed. The skies darkened across the eastern Mediterranean. It was the Bronze Age equivalent of the universe flipping over the dinner table. Archaeologists studying the ruins found entire settlements frozen in volcanic ash. Buildings remained preserved beneath layers of destruction like ancient time capsules. And strangely, unlike Pompeii many centuries later, very few bodies were discovered, which suggests something surprisingly hopeful. The people may have seen warning signs and escaped before the final eruption. Imagine the anxiety of that evacuation. The earthquakes, the smoke, the growing panic. Somebody desperately trying to load goats onto a boat while another man insists the volcano is probably calming down now. Because there is always that guy. Civilizations often imagine themselves eternal right up until the moment geology disagrees. For the Minoans, the eruption was catastrophic not simply because of physical destruction, but because complex societies depend on fragile systems. Trade routes, food supplies, political stability, shipping lanes. Destroy one piece, and the rest begins wobbling like a badly built chair. And once neighboring powers sensed weakness, the Minoans gradually faded from dominance. Their influence diminished. Their cities emptied. Their culture slowly dissolved into history. All because a volcano decided to redecorate the Mediterranean. Which feels unfair. But ancient history is full of unfairness. Now, interestingly, some scholars believe memories of Thera's destruction may have inspired later legends about lost civilizations, including the story of Atlantis described by Plato. And honestly, humans do this constantly. A terrible disaster happens. Survivors tell stories. Generations pass. Details become myths. Soon everyone is arguing about magical crystal civilizations beneath the ocean. Humanity really loves adding extra drama to things that were already dramatic enough. But volcanic destruction did not only shape islands and coastlines. It also quietly altered empires far inland. And for that, we drift slowly toward the towering shadow of Mount Vesuvius. Now Pompeii gets most of the attention because it is dramatic and visually memorable. Tourists love a tragedy preserved in ash, especially one involving surprisingly detailed frescoes and awkwardly frozen citizens. But the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD affected far more than one doomed Roman vacation town. The Roman world itself was deeply vulnerable to environmental instability. Crop failures mattered enormously. Trade disruptions mattered enormously. Disease spread easily during periods of famine and displacement. And volcanoes are exceptionally talented at causing all three. When Vesuvius erupted, nearby regions suffered massive agricultural damage. Ash buried farmland. Water systems became contaminated. Infrastructure collapsed. Roman writers described terrifying scenes. The sky turning black. Ash falling endlessly. People stumbling through darkness, carrying lamps in the middle of daytime, which sounds less like civilization and more like the world itself having a nervous breakdown. Pliny the Younger famously described the eruption in letters that still survive today. His account remains one of history's most important eyewitness descriptions of volcanic disaster. And even his writing has this strange, exhausted quality, like a man calmly explaining that the apocalypse is unfolding outside his window while trying very hard to remain polite about it. Meanwhile, his uncle, Pliny the Elder, sailed directly toward the eruption because he wanted to observe it scientifically, which is simultaneously admirable and perhaps the most Roman decision imaginable. Giant exploding mountain killing everyone nearby. Yes. Excellent opportunity for research. Unfortunately, he died during the disaster. Still, there is something weirdly human about it. Curiosity surviving right until the end. The Romans, despite all their engineering brilliance, could not negotiate with a volcano. Aqueducts were useless against ash clouds. Political speeches did not stop lava. Bureaucracy could not stabilize tectonic pressure. Nature remained larger than empire. That lesson repeated itself again and again throughout history. And one of the most devastating examples arrived in the year 536 AD. Now, technically, this event remains debated among historians because the exact volcano responsible is uncertain. It may have involved eruptions in Iceland, North America, or multiple locations simultaneously. But whatever happened, the results were grim enough that contemporary writers basically described the world turning dim and miserable, which, to be fair, already describes much of medieval history. Still, this was worse. Historical accounts from Europe, the Middle East, and Asia describe a mysterious haze covering the sky. Sunlight weakened. Temperatures dropped. Harvests failed. One historian wrote that the sun gave forth its light, without brightness, like the moon, which is poetically horrifying. Imagine living through that. No understanding of atmospheric science. No climate models. Just a weak gray sun hanging over failed crops and hungry populations. And because history occasionally enjoys piling disasters together like a bored cosmic intern, this environmental catastrophe was followed not long after by the plague of Justinian. Famine. Disease. Economic collapse. An absolutely exhausting sequence of events. The Byzantine Empire struggled enormously during this period. Emperor Justinian, I had dreams of restoring Roman greatness. Instead, he got volcanic cooling, plague outbreaks, military strain, and widespread suffering. History can be deeply sarcastic sometimes. Justinian probably imagined statues and triumphal celebrations. The universe handed him ash clouds and rats. And for ordinary people, life became brutally uncertain. Food shortages destabilized regions already under pressure. Communities weakened. Governments struggled to maintain authority. Entire populations became vulnerable to invasion, rebellion, or collapse. Civilizations are strongest when the climate behaves itself. Once harvests fail repeatedly, even powerful empires start sweating nervously under their expensive crowns. Which is a perfect place for us to pause tonight's first journey through ancient volcanic catastrophe. Because the Earth, as we will continue discovering, has many more ways to ruin a civilization's afternoon. And next time, we will wander deeper into volcanic winters, collapsing kingdoms, and rulers trying very hard to look calm while mountains explode behind them, which, historically speaking, almost never works. So settle back in again. Maybe adjust the pillow slightly. Maybe stare at the ceiling for a moment while contemplating the deeply unsettling reality that human civilization has always depended on the sun continuing to function normally, which sounds obvious. But ancient people did not wake up expecting the sky itself to malfunction. And yet, during the 6th century, that is exactly what seemed to happen. For people living through the year 536 AD, the world became strangely dim. Chroniclers across Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia all described the same eerie phenomenon. A dry fog, a veil in the sky, weak sunlight, cold summers. The sort of atmosphere that would make even optimistic farmers quietly panic into their soup. Modern scientists believe enormous volcanic eruptions filled the atmosphere with sulfur particles that reflected sunlight away from Earth. Triggering evidence suggests temperatures dropped sharply for years. And ancient civilizations, unfortunately, were not built for climate surprises. Today, if harvests fail in one region, governments can import food from somewhere else. Cargo ships move grain across oceans. Grocery stores remain magically stocked with 17 kinds of yogurt for reasons nobody fully understands. But medieval societies existed much closer to starvation. A few bad harvests could unravel entire kingdoms. And when the sky dimmed after 536, harvests collapsed in many regions almost immediately. The Byzantine historian Procopius wrote that the sun appeared dim for over a year. Other chroniclers described snow during summer months in China. Crops failed in Ireland. Famine spread. Imagine trying to explain this without modern science. 1 week the weather feels strange. Then colder. Then darker. Crops stop growing properly. Livestock weaken. People begin whispering that perhaps the gods are angry again. Because ancient civilizations blamed gods for absolutely everything. Drought? Gods. Floods? Gods. Volcano explodes and darkens the sky for 18 months? Definitely gods. Meanwhile, the volcano itself is sitting quietly in the distance, like an exhausted employee refusing responsibility. And honestly, volcanic winters create the perfect conditions for fear and superstition. Humans become deeply uncomfortable when nature stops behaving predictably, which is understandable. We barely handle mild inconveniences now. One delayed package and modern society collectively loses emotional stability. But in the 6th century, uncertainty meant genuine danger. Food shortages led to migration. Migration created conflict. Governments weakened. Trade slowed. Disease spread more easily among malnourished populations. And then, because history occasionally behaves like a writer trying too hard to raise the stakes, the plague arrived. The plague of Justinian began around 541 AD and tore through the Mediterranean world. Cities emptied, mass graves filled, entire communities vanished. The Byzantine Empire, already weakened by famine and climate instability, suddenly faced a pandemic on top of everything else, which feels deeply unfair even by historical standards. Emperor Justinian I himself contracted the plague and barely survived. This was a man obsessed with restoring Roman glory. He built magnificent churches. He reorganized law codes. He launched ambitious military campaigns. And then nature casually reminded him that no emperor, no matter how dramatic his robes, controls bacteria or volcanoes. The empire lost massive portions of its population. Tax revenues collapsed. Armies weakened. Entire regions struggled to recover for generations. Historians still debate how much volcanic cooling contributed to these disasters, but the timing is difficult to ignore. One environmental shock triggered another, then another. Civilization is often less stable than it appears. And volcanic eruptions have a habit of exposing every weakness at once. Now, while Europe and the Mediterranean stumbled through cold skies and plague carts, other parts of the world faced their own volcanic catastrophes. So let's drift gently eastward toward ancient Japan, where volcanoes were practically part of daily existence. Japan sits along the Pacific Ring of Fire, which sounds exciting until you remember it means the ground is constantly threatening to explode. Mountain smoke. Earthquakes shake villages. Tsunamis arrive uninvited. Entire landscapes shift unexpectedly. And through all this, Japanese civilization somehow continued functioning with remarkable persistence. Although, admittedly, everyone probably remained at least slightly nervous all the time. One of the most important eruptions in Japanese history came from Mount Fuji in 864 AD. Now today Mount Fuji appears serene and elegant. It sits peacefully in artwork while tourists photograph it from safe distances and pretend hiking it sounds enjoyable. But Fuji is still a volcano. A very large volcano. And during the 9th century, it erupted violently enough to bury entire villages beneath lava and ash. Forests burned. Lakes formed from blocked rivers. Agricultural land vanished. The eruption terrified nearby populations not only because of physical destruction, but because volcanoes carried spiritual significance in Japanese culture. Natural disasters often blended with religious meaning. Eruptions were interpreted through the lens of divine imbalance, angry spirits, or cosmic warning, which makes sense in a world where mountains occasionally catch fire for no obvious reason. Humans need explanations. Even inaccurate explanations feel emotionally comforting compared to pure randomness. And rulers throughout history understood this perfectly. Whenever disaster struck, leaders rushed to frame events in ways that protected their authority. Sometimes they blamed moral decline. Sometimes foreign enemies. Sometimes insufficient prayer. Rarely did kings announce, "Unfortunately, our empire has been temporarily defeated by atmospheric sulfur," which is probably how they should have phrased it. And speaking of rulers struggling helplessly against geological chaos, we now float softly toward one of the most famous volcanic disasters in human history, the eruption of Krakatoa in 1883. Now, technically this eruption happened long after the ancient world, but it perfectly demonstrates how even industrial societies remain vulnerable when Earth decides to behave theatrically. Krakatoa exploded with such force that people thousands of miles away heard the sound. Not metaphorically, actually heard it. The explosion generated tsunamis that killed tens of thousands. Entire coastal settlements vanished beneath walls of water. Ash entered the atmosphere and produced strange sunsets across the globe. People in England painted unusually vivid red skies afterward, completely unaware they were witnessing the atmospheric leftovers of a volcano on the other side of the planet, which is honestly one of the eeriest details in environmental history. Nature is deeply interconnected in ways humans constantly underestimate. One eruption alters global temperatures. One ash cloud changes weather patterns. One collapsing mountain reshapes distant coastlines. And despite all our technology, we still mostly react afterward while pretending we are prepared. Victorian newspapers covered Krakatoa obsessively. The event fascinated the industrial world because it revealed something uncomfortable. Modern civilization was not immune. Steamships, telegraphs, factories, and colonial empires suddenly looked fragile beside one exploding island. And this realization quietly haunted many intellectuals of the era. The 19th century loved progress. People genuinely believed technology would conquer nature. Industry would solve problems. Science would master the planet. Then Krakatoa erupted loud enough to circle the globe several times. A humbling moment. One scientist described atmospheric shockwaves traveling repeatedly around Earth after the blast. Imagine sitting in a Victorian observatory while instruments quietly confirm that a volcano just punched the atmosphere hard enough to ripple around the entire planet. Not ideal for confidence. And yet humanity adapted again. That is the strange recurring theme in all these disasters. Civilizations crack. Systems fail. Populations suffer horribly. But survivors continue. Farmers replant fields. Cities rebuild. Children grow up hearing stories about the terrible year the sky went dark or the sea swallowed villages, or ash covered the harvest. And gradually catastrophe becomes history, which humans immediately start romanticizing for some reason. People love turning disasters into legends once enough time has passed. A volcano destroys your civilization? Tragic. A volcano destroys your civilization 2,000 years ago? Excellent documentary material. And nowhere is this transformation from horror to myth more visible than in the story of Maya civilization. Now the Maya were not destroyed by a single supervolcano in dramatic movie fashion. Real history is usually slower and more exhausting than that. But volcanic activity absolutely shaped their world. The Maya lived in a region filled with volcanic highlands, unstable environments, and shifting climate patterns. Eruptions periodically damaged agriculture and disrupted trade routes throughout Central America. One major eruption from the Ilopango caldera in present-day El Salvador around the 6th century may have devastated large portions of the region. Ash buried farmland. Communities disappeared. Trade networks fractured. Some researchers believe the eruption contributed significantly to political instability across Maya territories. Again, we see the same pattern. Environmental disaster weakens systems already under pressure. Then social collapse follows gradually afterward. Civilizations rarely fall in one dramatic moment. Usually they unravel slowly, while exhausted rulers insist everything remains under control, which feels oddly modern. And the Maya elite were particularly vulnerable to environmental failure because their authority depended heavily on religious legitimacy. Kings claimed spiritual power. They performed elaborate ceremonies. They promised cosmic order. But if crops failed repeatedly and ash kept falling from the sky, people understandably began questioning management. Ancient peasants may not have understood volcanic chemistry, but they absolutely understood hunger. And hungry populations become difficult to impress with ceremonial costumes. Eventually, many major Maya cities declined or emptied altogether. Climate stress, warfare, political instability, and environmental disruption all blended together into a long, complicated collapse. Not one single apocalypse, just generations of worsening problems, which honestly describes many civilizations throughout history. Empires prefer imagining themselves eternal. Reality tends to be muddier. Now, before we end tonight's wandering journey, let's briefly visit one final volcanic tragedy. A quieter one. Not an empire-ending explosion. Not a civilization collapse. Just an example of ordinary human stubbornness beside dangerous mountains. In ancient Iceland, settlers lived among volcanic landscapes that constantly threatened farms and villages. Lava fields stretched across the countryside. Steam vents hissed from the earth. Eruptions periodically poisoned livestock and darkened skies. And yet people stayed. Because humans are remarkably persistent creatures. Also, land was limited. And medieval Icelanders were not exactly spoiled for housing options. So families continued raising sheep beside volcanoes that occasionally exploded with terrifying violence. One eruption in 1783 from the Loki fissure released enormous amounts of toxic gas across Europe. Livestock died in huge numbers. Crops failed. Famine spread. The haze even affected weather patterns across the northern hemisphere. Benjamin Franklin, of all people, later speculated that volcanic dust might explain strange climate conditions, which is delightful. Even while helping invent modern politics, Franklin apparently found time to wonder whether Icelandic volcanoes were ruining everyone's weather. A true multitasker. And once again, the same lesson emerged. Human civilization depends heavily on environmental stability. Remove stable weather, reliable harvests, or predictable seasons, and even sophisticated societies begin stumbling around anxiously, which makes volcanoes oddly democratic. They do not care about kings, armies, religions, borders, or economic systems. Ash falls on everyone equally. And tonight, as we slowly drift towards sleep, perhaps that is the strangely comforting thought beneath all this destruction. Human history has always unfolded under forces far larger than itself. Empires rise proudly. Dynasties accumulate wealth. Rulers commission statues with very confident facial expressions. And meanwhile, deep beneath the ground, magma quietly waits without the slightest interest in politics. Very relaxing, very humbling. And unfortunately for future civilizations, the planet is not done yet. By now, hopefully, you are feeling pleasantly sleepy. Perhaps slightly concerned about magma chambers beneath the Earth's crust, but mostly sleepy. Tonight we continue drifting through the long relationship between civilizations and volcanoes. A relationship that mostly consisted of humans building expensive cities near dangerous mountains and then acting deeply surprised when those mountains eventually exploded, which happened repeatedly. Because fertile volcanic soil is incredibly good for farming. Crops grow beautifully there. Kingdoms become wealthy. Populations expand. And then every few centuries, the mountain reminds everyone that the soil is fertile for deeply alarming reasons. So, let us gently wander now into the ancient Roman world again, because the Romans truly had an unmatched talent for ignoring obvious danger signs. Particularly wealthy Romans. Especially wealthy Romans with seaside villas. After the eruption of Mount Vesuvius destroyed Pompeii and Herculaneum in 79 AD, you might imagine people would avoid the area forever. But no. Romans looked at the smoking volcanic region that had recently buried entire towns and basically said, "Still lovely weather though." And gradually people returned. Because the Bay of Naples was beautiful. The farmland remained fertile. The sea views were excellent. Human beings consistently prioritize good scenery over survival instincts. Even emperors did this. Several Roman elites built luxurious villas near volcanic zones. Wealthy nobles relaxed in bathhouses beneath mountains capable of catastrophic eruption. Farmers replanted vineyards in ash-rich soil. It is one of the strangest recurring patterns in history. Nature causes horrifying destruction. Then humans slowly redecorate the disaster zone and continue as before. And honestly, there is something very sleepy and eternal about that cycle. Volcanoes erupt. Grass grows back. Goats wander through ruins. Some nobleman eventually arrives announcing this would be a wonderful location for a summer home. Meanwhile, the mountain sits silently in the background like a villain pretending to reform. Now, while the Romans rebuilt around Vesuvius, another volcanic threat loomed farther south beneath the Mediterranean. The enormous volcanic system known as the Campi Flegrei, which translates roughly to burning fields, a name that really should have discouraged development more than it did. Campi Flegrei is not a traditional cone-shaped volcano. It is a massive caldera, a giant volcanic depression formed by ancient eruptions so powerful they collapsed entire sections of Earth's crust inward. The region bubbles with geothermal activity. Steam vents hiss from the ground. Sulfur rises from cracks. The Earth itself occasionally lifts and sinks over time. And naturally, the Romans looked at this unsettling landscape and decided it was perfect for luxury resorts. Of course they did. Roman aristocrats adored the area. Hot springs attracted wealthy visitors. Villas spread across the coastline. Emperors vacationed there. Because nothing says restful holiday quite like sleeping above a supervolcano. The Romans even believed parts of the region connected to the underworld. Ancient myths described entrances to Hades nearby, which honestly feels less like mythology and more like reasonable observation. If the ground around you constantly emits sulfur fumes and strange noises, eventually somebody is going to assume the dead live downstairs. And to be fair, sulfur smells exactly like a place nobody wants to visit eternally. Now, fortunately for the Roman Empire, Campi Flegrei did not produce a civilization-ending eruption during antiquity. But smaller eruptions and earthquakes repeatedly damaged nearby settlements over centuries. Entire towns slowly sank beneath shifting coastlines as volcanic activity altered the landscape. Imagine trying to maintain political authority while the earth beneath your city physically moves up and down. Difficult branding situation for an empire claiming eternal stability. And speaking of rulers attempting confidence beside geological chaos, let us float softly eastward toward ancient China. Because Chinese history contains some of the most detailed environmental records in the ancient world. Imperial bureaucrats documented everything. Harvests, floods, comets, earthquakes. Probably somebody assigned full-time to recording suspicious cloud shapes. Chinese dynasties understood that natural disasters carried enormous political significance. According to the concept of the mandate of heaven, emperors ruled with divine approval, which sounds excellent during good weather. But when earthquakes struck or volcanoes erupted or floods devastated provinces, people began wondering whether heaven had quietly fired the emperor. An awkward situation politically. And Chinese rulers took these signs very seriously. Court officials often interpreted disasters as warnings against corruption, poor governance, or moral decline, which meant volcanic eruptions could indirectly destabilize entire dynasties. Imagine being emperor and hearing that a distant mountain exploded. Not only are villages destroyed, but now scholars are writing essays suggesting heaven personally disapproves of your leadership. Very stressful. One particularly important volcanic event occurred in 946 AD when the Shangbeichen volcano erupted with tremendous force. The eruption spread ash across enormous distances. Japanese records described white ash falling like snow hundreds of miles away. Entire regional climates may have been affected temporarily. And because medieval societies depended heavily on agricultural stability, even short-term disruptions created ripple effects throughout economies and governments. This is something modern people often forget. Ancient empires operated very close to environmental limits. One failed harvest mattered enormously. One disrupted monsoon mattered enormously. One eruption could trigger years of migration, unrest, or famine. Civilizations often appear powerful right until nature gently removes one critical support beam. Then suddenly everyone is fighting over grain supplies, while court officials write increasingly nervous reports. And nobody handled nervous official paperwork quite like medieval Europe. So naturally we now drift there. Because medieval Europeans interpreted volcanic disasters with an absolutely exhausting level of religious panic. Every unusual natural event became evidence of divine anger. Volcano erupts. Punishment. Earthquake. Punishment. Strange weather. Definitely punishment. At some point, medieval priests must have been absolutely exhausted trying to explain why God remained so consistently irritated. One eruption that deeply affected Europe came from Mount Etna. Etna has erupted constantly throughout recorded history. Ancient Greeks, Romans, Byzantines, Arabs, Normans, and countless others all watched this enormous Sicilian volcano periodically fling lava into the sky. Entire generations grew up beneath its shadow, and Etna became woven deeply into mythology. The Greeks believed the forge of Hephaestus existed beneath the mountain. Others imagined imprisoned giants causing eruptions through their movements underground. Honestly, compared to modern geology, giant trapped monsters are not significantly less comforting. At least monsters can theoretically be negotiated with. Magma pressure does not care about your feelings. Now, medieval rulers in Sicily faced a constant balancing act. The volcanic soil around Etna produced excellent agriculture. Vineyards flourished. Towns prospered. But eruptions repeatedly destroyed homes and farmland. Lava flows crept slowly toward villages while local nobles tried maintaining order and collecting taxes, which feels slightly unreasonable. Imagine tax collectors arriving while lava advances down a hillside. Terribly sorry about the molten rock consuming your olive trees, but the crown still requires payment. History truly never loses confidence. And the peasants living near Etna adapted in fascinating ways. Entire communities developed routines around volcanic danger. They observed smoke patterns, earth tremors, changes in animal behavior. Generations accumulated practical survival knowledge without fully understanding the underlying science. Because humans are remarkably good at adapting to terrifying situations if given enough time. Eventually, almost anything becomes normal. People can normalize earthquakes, famine, plague, even living beside active volcanoes, which may explain modern office culture too. Now, while Europe interpreted eruptions through religion, civilizations in Central and South America often connected volcanoes to sacred cosmology and divine forces. The Aztec civilization lived among dramatic, volcanic landscapes. Mountains shaped mythology, warfare, agriculture, and ritual life. And towering above everything stood Popocatépetl, which is both difficult to pronounce and deeply intimidating. The Aztecs associated volcanoes with gods, sacrifice, and cosmic struggle. Eruptions reinforce beliefs about unstable divine forces governing the world, which honestly feels emotionally accurate. Volcanoes do make existence seem unstable. Aztec rulers performed elaborate ceremonies intended to maintain cosmic balance. Human sacrifice formed part of this worldview. Leaders genuinely feared that divine order required constant maintenance, a stressful religious system overall. And when natural disasters struck, anxiety intensified enormously. Because unlike modern governments issuing weather advisories, ancient priesthoods often responded with rituals, omens, and increasingly dramatic ceremonies. Imagine already worrying about ash clouds while priests announce the gods also require more human hearts immediately. Not ideal for community morale. Yet despite constant threats, these civilizations flourished for centuries. Cities expanded. Markets thrived. Temples rose beside volcanic mountains. Again and again, humanity demonstrated the same stubborn pattern. Danger does not necessarily stop civilization. Sometimes it actually encourages it. Volcanic regions often become rich agricultural centers precisely because eruptions renew soil fertility over long periods, which means many great civilizations were effectively built atop ancient destruction. Beautiful concept, really. Also mildly horrifying. And nowhere was this balance between fertility and catastrophe more dramatic than in ancient Indonesia. Indonesia contains more active volcanoes than almost anywhere on Earth. Entire kingdoms rose and fell among volcanic islands. Trade routes connected spice-rich territories shaped constantly by eruptions. And among these volcanoes stood one especially terrifying mountain, Mount Tambora. Now Tambora's great eruption happened in 1815, outside the ancient world technically, but its global effects were so immense that historians still speak about it with exhausted disbelief. Tambora exploded with extraordinary force. Ash clouds spread worldwide. Global temperatures dropped. Harvests failed across multiple continents. And 1816 became known as the year without a summer. Which sounds poetic until you remember people starved. Snow fell during summer in parts of North America. European crops collapsed. Food prices soared. Riots erupted. And because history enjoys strange little side effects, Gloomy weather during this period also indirectly inspired famous works of literature. At a rainy gathering in Switzerland, Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein while trapped indoors by miserable volcanic weather conditions. So, technically, one Indonesian volcano helped create modern science fiction. The planet really enjoys complicated storytelling. Meanwhile, ordinary people suffered enormously. Farmers lost livelihoods. Families migrated searching for food. Governments struggled to maintain stability amid shortages and unrest. Again, we see the familiar truth. Environmental catastrophe exposes every weakness already present in society. The wealthy usually survive more comfortably. The poor suffer first and hardest. Kings keep eating dinner while peasants sell furniture for grain. Some things in history remained depressingly consistent. And yet, even after Tambora, humans rebuilt again. Fields recovered. Cities expanded. Trade resumed. Children grew up hearing stories about the strange cold year when harvests failed and skies looked wrong. Then, eventually, the memory softened into history, because humanity possesses a remarkable ability to continue, even after darkness, even after ash, even after the earth itself seems briefly hostile. And perhaps that is why volcanoes fascinate us so deeply. They remind us simultaneously how fragile civilization is and how stubbornly human beings survive anyway, which is a strangely comforting thing to fall asleep thinking about. Though maybe not if you currently live near a volcano. In that case, perhaps avoid Googling local magma activity before bed. As the night drifts on, let's continue wandering slowly through the long history of civilizations trying very hard to look calm while the Earth quietly prepared another geological tantrum beneath them, which, to be fair, describes much of human history. People build temples. Kings hold ceremonies. Priests announce eternal stability. Then somewhere underground, magma begins moving around like an irritated pot of soup. And eventually, everyone has a difficult week. Tonight, we drift first toward the ancient Mediterranean again, because the Greeks truly had an extraordinary ability to turn terrifying natural disasters into complicated mythology. Volcanoes especially fascinated them. Ancient Greeks lived in a landscape shaped by earthquakes, islands, and volcanic activity. Mountains smoked ominously across the sea. Hot springs bubbled from the ground. Entire coastlines shifted over centuries. And naturally, they concluded giant supernatural beings must be involved. Which honestly feels reasonable if you have never seen a geology textbook. The Greeks believed volcanic eruptions often came from imprisoned monsters buried beneath mountains. One famous example involved the monstrous Typhon, supposedly trapped beneath volcanic regions after battling the gods. Whenever eruptions occurred, people imagined Typhon thrashing angrily underground. And honestly, that explanation carries a certain emotional clarity modern science lacks. Magma pressure within tectonic systems sounds informative. Angry underground monster having emotional episode sounds memorable. The volcanic island of Sicily became especially tied to these myths because of Mount Etna. Etna erupted constantly throughout ancient history. Greek settlers watched lava crawl down hillsides while smoke darkened the sky above their colonies. Yet they stayed. Again and again, humans remain near volcanoes because volcanic soil created rich farmland. This is perhaps the greatest recurring bargain in environmental history. Terrifying mountain may someday annihilate entire region. Yes, but the grapes grow beautifully. Civilization repeatedly accepted this trade. And Greek colonies around Sicily became wealthy because of agriculture connected indirectly to volcanic activity. Wheat flourished. Vineyards spread across fertile land. Meanwhile, Etna occasionally exploded in the background like an overworked god demanding attention. Greek philosophers attempted to explain eruptions rationally. Some imagined underground winds fueling volcanic fires. Others theorized vast subterranean caverns filled with heat and sulfur, which, honestly, was not terrible reasoning considering the tools available. Ancient humans were often surprisingly observant. They noticed patterns. Earthquakes sometimes preceded eruptions. Springs changed temperature. Animals behaved strangely before disasters. People living near volcanoes developed generational knowledge passed quietly through families and communities, because survival depended on paying attention. And speaking of paying attention, no civilization observed volcanic danger more closely than the people of ancient Hawaii. Now, technically Hawaii was settled much later than many ancient civilizations, but Polynesian traditions surrounding volcanoes are some of the most beautiful and emotionally rich in human history. The Hawaiian Islands themselves were born from volcanic activity. Entire landscapes rose directly from lava emerging beneath the ocean. Imagine arriving by canoe after weeks at sea and discovering islands literally built from fire. A dramatic introduction to real estate. Volcanoes shaped Hawaiian spirituality deeply. The goddess Pele became one of the most powerful figures in Hawaiian mythology. Pele was not simply destructive. She was emotional, creative, dangerous, capable of both beauty and devastation, which actually mirrors volcanoes remarkably well. Lava destroys forests and villages. Then over time it creates new land, new soil, new ecosystems. Volcanoes are both catastrophic and strangely creative. A very complicated personality type for a mountain. Hawaiian oral traditions preserved detailed memories of eruptions across generations. Stories described lava flows consuming settlements, battles between fire and water, and migrations triggered by volcanic activity. These stories were not primitive superstition, despite what colonial writers later claimed. They were sophisticated cultural memory systems. People encoded survival knowledge into narrative and myth, because humans remember stories better than instruction manuals. And honestly, if your island contains active volcanoes, having a memorable fire goddess is probably more effective than distributing geological pamphlets. Now, while Hawaiian traditions respected volcanoes as sacred forces, European colonizers arriving centuries later often treated them more like scientific curiosities, which is extremely on brand for Europeans. By the 18th and 19th centuries, scientists became obsessed with studying volcanic activity. Explorers climbed dangerous mountains carrying notebooks and terrible survival instincts. Many of them behaved exactly like Pliny the Elder centuries earlier. Potentially deadly eruption underway. Excellent opportunity to stand closer. And this growing scientific interest slowly changed how humanity understood disaster itself. For most of history, volcanoes were interpreted spiritually or morally. Eruptions reflected divine anger, cosmic imbalance, or supernatural conflict. But modern geology revealed something simultaneously comforting and unsettling. Volcanoes are not personal. The earth is not angry. Magma does not care about morality, kingship, prayer, or human ambition. Tectonic plates move because physics says so, which is oddly calming and slightly insulting. Human civilization spent thousands of years imagining itself central to cosmic meaning, only for geology to quietly explain that continents are basically floating rock slabs bumping into each other. Very humbling for emperors. And few emperors needed humbling more than those of ancient Roman Empire during periods of environmental crisis. Because Roman elites truly believed their civilization represented eternal order. They built massive monuments celebrating permanence. Marble temples, endless roads, giant triumphal arches. Everything about Roman architecture screamed confidence. Then volcanoes, earthquakes, floods, and plagues repeatedly reminded them that nature had not signed any agreement guaranteeing stability. One fascinating example occurred during the reign of Emperor Titus after the eruption of Vesuvius. Titus attempted to manage disaster relief personally. He organized aid for affected regions and reportedly sold imperial property to support rebuilding efforts. Which sounds noble. And it was. But there is also something deeply tragic about emperors trying to administratively solve volcanic catastrophe. As if bureaucracy might somehow negotiate with molten rock. Roman historians praised Titus heavily afterward, partly because emperors were expected to demonstrate calm authority during disasters. A ruler who panicked looked weak. So even while ash-buried towns and refugees flooded nearby regions, imperial leadership had to maintain the performance of control. Governments throughout history have done this constantly. Disaster strikes. Officials appear publicly composed. Everybody quietly hopes the situation improves before the food supply collapses. Sometimes it works. Sometimes the volcano wins. And speaking of governments trying very hard not to collapse, let us float now toward the ancient civilizations of the Andes in South America. Because the Andes Mountains contain some of the most volcanically active regions on Earth. And civilizations there developed extraordinary ways of adapting to unstable environments. The Inca Empire ruled enormous territories across mountainous volcanic landscapes. Their engineers built roads, terraces, and cities at astonishing altitudes. Honestly, the Incas approached mountains with an almost concerning level of confidence. Steep cliffs? Build a city there. Volcanic slopes? Excellent farming opportunity. Narrow ridge surrounded by terrifying drops? Perfect location for architecture. And somehow it worked beautifully for centuries. Volcanoes shaped Andean religion deeply. Mountains themselves were sacred beings known as apis. Many peaks were believed to possess spiritual power and influence over weather, agriculture, and human fortune. Volcanic eruptions therefore carried enormous religious significance. Priests conducted ceremonies on mountain summits. Sacrifices were offered to maintain harmony with powerful natural forces. Again, we see the same recurring human instinct. When faced with overwhelming environmental danger, societies seek meaning. Meaning helps people endure uncertainty. And uncertainty defined life near volcanoes. Entire harvests could disappear after ashfall. Earthquakes could destroy irrigation systems. Overnight, trade routes through mountain passes became vulnerable to eruptions and landslides. Yet, Andean civilizations adapted remarkably well through flexible agriculture and regional diversity. The Incas especially built food storage systems across their empire to survive environmental disruption. A genuinely smart idea. Unlike many rulers throughout history who apparently planned for disasters by simply hoping they would not happen, which, historically speaking, has a terrible success rate. Now, while the Incas managed environmental instability skillfully, other societies struggled much more dramatically when volcanoes altered climate. And perhaps nowhere was this more devastating than during the decline of Norse settlements in Greenland. The Norse colonies established in Greenland during the medieval warm period survived for centuries through farming, hunting, and trade. But as climate conditions worsened during the Little Ice Age, life became increasingly difficult, and volcanic activity may have contributed significantly to those cooling trends. Volcanic aerosols can lower global temperatures temporarily by blocking sunlight. Multiple eruptions across decades can amplify climate instability dramatically. For isolated Norse settlers already living at the edge of survival, even small temperature shifts mattered enormously. Growing seasons shortened. Sea ice expanded. Trade routes became unreliable. Livestock struggled. And eventually the Greenland colonies disappeared. Not through one dramatic apocalypse. No giant battle. No cinematic final stand. Just slow environmental decline. A very quiet kind of collapse, which is often how civilizations actually end. Not with explosions, with exhaustion. People leave gradually. Buildings decay. Trade stops. Children move elsewhere seeking easier lives. Then centuries later, archaeologists arrive looking deeply excited about broken pottery. History can feel strangely cold sometimes, and volcanoes contribute to this slow instability more often than people realize, because the greatest danger is not always lava. Sometimes it is subtle climate disruptions spreading quietly across years or decades. One failed harvest, then another, then migration, then unrest. Then political fragmentation. Civilizations rarely notice they are collapsing while it happens. Everyone assumes the crisis is temporary right until the systems holding society together quietly stop functioning. And honestly, modern people probably underestimate this because we imagine collapse dramatically. Movies taught us to expect giant explosions and screaming crowds. Real history is slower, more bureaucratic, more tired. Kings continue issuing decrees while food shortages worsen. Officials continue collecting taxes while roads deteriorate. Priests continue promising stability while ash drifts across fields. And ordinary people simply try to survive another winter. Which brings us gently back to one of the strangest truths about volcanoes. They destroy civilizations, but they also create the conditions for civilization. Volcanic soil feeds millions. Volcanic minerals enrich farmland. Entire trade networks emerged around fertile volcanic regions. Some of humanity's greatest cities existed precisely because ancient eruptions had once transformed the land. Destruction and creation constantly intertwined. A deeply sleepy cycle. Ash becomes soil. Soil feeds kingdoms. Kingdoms rise proudly. Then eventually another eruption arrives. And the whole process begins again. Very poetic. Very inconvenient for the people living through it. And tonight, as we continue drifting through the long, uneasy marriage between humanity and the earth beneath it, perhaps the most comforting realization is this. Civilizations have always survived uncertainty. Even under dark skies. Even beside burning mountains. Even while pretending they were far more in control than they actually were. Which, honestly, remains humanity's favorite tradition. Tonight we continue our slow journey through the ancient world of supervolcanoes, collapsing harvests, anxious rulers, and humanity's endless determination to build cities in places clearly marked by nature as potentially disastrous, which people continue doing
constantly.
There is something deeply optimistic about civilization. Entire generations settle beside volcanoes thinking, well, surely it will not erupt during our lifetime. And sometimes they are correct. Other times archaeologists discover their kitchen bowls beneath 20 feet of ash 2,000 years later. History really keeps everyone humble. Now, earlier we spoke about eruptions destroying cities directly. Lava flows, ashfall, tsunamis, entire landscapes rearranged overnight. But some volcanic disasters worked more quietly, more slowly, like a sickness spreading through climate itself. And perhaps the most fascinating part of all this is that ancient people often had no idea what was actually happening. Imagine living through years of strange weather without modern science, cold summers, failed harvests, endless gray skies. Animals behaving strangely. People would naturally search for meaning. Some blamed angry gods. Others blamed sinful rulers. And medieval Europeans, of course, blamed absolutely everybody, which remained one of Europe's favorite hobbies for centuries. But volcanic ash drifting through the upper atmosphere could alter climates across entire continents. Tiny particles reflected sunlight away from Earth, cooling temperatures and disrupting rainfall patterns. One eruption in a distant corner of the world could quietly ruin harvests thousands of miles away, which feels deeply unfair. A farmer in medieval France wakes up to failing crops because a volcano erupted months earlier in Indonesia, and nobody involved fully understands why. The interconnectedness of nature is honestly a little rude sometimes. Now, one civilization that experienced repeated volcanic disruptions was ancient Egypt. Egypt depended heavily on the annual flooding of the Nile River. The entire agricultural system revolved around predictable environmental rhythms, which worked beautifully when nature cooperated. But volcanic eruptions could disrupt global weather enough to weaken monsoon systems feeding the Nile. And when the Nile flood failed, Egypt suffered immediately. Food shortages spread. Political unrest increased. Tax systems weakened. And because ancient states loved taxing farmers right up until collapse, tensions escalated quickly. Some historians now believe volcanic eruptions may have contributed to periods of instability during the reign of the Ptolemaic kingdom, including the era of Cleopatra VII herself, which means one of history's most famous queens may have spent part of her reign dealing with climate problems indirectly linked to volcanic eruptions elsewhere on Earth. And honestly, Cleopatra already had enough problems. Roman politics, civil war, imperial ambition, Julius Caesar dramatically arriving everywhere. Then somewhere across the globe, a volcano darkens the atmosphere, and suddenly the Nile behaves unpredictably. An exhausting century overall. Ancient rulers constantly faced this challenge. Their authority depended heavily on environmental stability. Good harvests strengthened governments. Bad harvests weakened them.
Simple as that.
Because hungry populations become less impressed by royal pageantry remarkably quickly. A king wearing gold robes means very little when grain prices triple. And volcanoes repeatedly triggered these dangerous moments of instability. Now, while Egypt depended on river floods, civilizations in Asia relied heavily on monsoon systems, which were also vulnerable to volcanic disruption. The great kingdoms of India experienced cycles of famine and climate stress throughout history, some potentially linked to major eruptions. Monsoons are delicate systems. Small temperature changes in oceans or atmosphere can alter rainfall patterns dramatically. And volcanic aerosols drifting through the atmosphere sometimes shifted those patterns enough to damage crops across enormous regions. Imagine ruling an empire where seasonal rain determines survival for millions of people. Then suddenly the rains arrive late, or weakly, or not at all. Ancient rulers performed ceremonies, offered prayers, consulted astrologers, and blamed corruption because they lacked scientific explanations. But emotionally, they understood something important. Environmental stability underpins civilization itself. Without reliable food production, everything else starts wobbling.
Trade.
Military power, political legitimacy, public order, all connected. And volcanoes had an extraordinary ability to quietly disrupt those connections from thousands of miles away. Now, perhaps one of the strangest examples of volcanic influence on civilization involves the collapse of Bronze Age societies around 1200 BC. This period saw widespread destruction across the eastern Mediterranean. Major kingdoms weakened or vanished. Trade networks collapsed. Cities burned. Writing systems disappeared in some regions. Historians call it the Bronze Age collapse, which sounds dramatic because it absolutely was. Now many factors contributed. Warfare, migration, economic instability, political fragmentation. The mysterious sea peoples showing up everywhere causing problems like ancient maritime chaos goblins. But environmental stress likely played a major role too. Some researchers suspect volcanic activity contributed to climate instability during this already fragile period. And once again, we encounter the same historical pattern. Complex civilizations become vulnerable when food systems weaken. Because Bronze Age kingdoms depended heavily on interconnected trade. Tin from one region, copper from another. Grain shipments moving across seas. Everything functioned together like a delicate machine. Then environmental disruption arrives, and suddenly entire systems begin failing simultaneously. A surprisingly modern-feeling disaster. The ancient Mycenaean Greece declined during this chaotic era. Hittite power collapsed in Anatolia. Cities across the eastern Mediterranean suffered destruction or abandonment. And afterward, much knowledge simply vanished. Writing disappeared from parts of Greece for centuries. Imagine civilization becoming so unstable that literacy itself declines. A genuinely horrifying concept for historians. Probably delightful for goats, though. Goats thrive during human collapse. Nobody ever mentions this enough. Now, while Bronze Age kingdoms unraveled around the Mediterranean, volcanic disasters continued shaping cultures elsewhere too. In ancient Japan, eruptions repeatedly altered political and religious life. One particularly devastating eruption came from Mount Asama in 1783. Again, not ancient technically, but deeply illustrative of how volcanic disaster affects society. The eruption devastated farmland during an already difficult economic period. Ash buried crops. Famine spread. Tens of thousands died. And, importantly, social unrest increased afterward. Because environmental catastrophe rarely stays purely environmental. It becomes political. People question leadership during crises. Authorities struggle to distribute resources fairly. Rumors spread. Fear spreads faster, and ordinary people suffer while elites debate policy in comfortable rooms. Some traditions remain timeless. The Tokugawa shogunate faced growing criticism after the famine worsened. Relief efforts often proved inadequate or corrupt. And once again, we see how natural disasters expose existing weaknesses within governments. A strong system bends under pressure. A weak system fractures. Volcanoes are excellent stress tests for civilizations. Now, speaking of stress, let us gently drift toward medieval Iceland again, because Icelanders lived with a truly unreasonable number of volcanoes. Honestly, the entire island feels like Earth showing off. Lava fields, geysers, earthquakes, glaciers sitting beside magma chambers, steam vents emerging from nowhere. It is visually beautiful and emotionally concerning. And medieval Icelandic communities adapted with remarkable toughness. Sagas described eruptions almost matter-of-factly. Farm destroyed by lava.
Sheep died.
Winter unpleasant. Anyway, a very Nordic style of emotional processing. But beneath that calm tone, eruptions caused enormous suffering. Toxic gases poisoned livestock. Ash contaminated water. Famine followed bad eruptions repeatedly. One particularly severe eruption from the Loki fissure in 1783 released so much sulfur dioxide that a poisonous haze spread across Europe. People reported breathing difficulties. Crop failures worsened. Weather patterns shifted. Some historians even argue the resulting economic stress contributed indirectly to unrest before the French Revolution, which means there is at least a tiny possibility that Icelandic magma helped destabilize the French monarchy. History is wonderfully strange sometimes. Imagine explaining to Louis XVI that sulfur drifting from Iceland may be contributing to social unrest in Paris. He already seemed emotionally overwhelmed by regular politics. Volcanic atmospheric chemistry probably would not have improved morale. And yet nature constantly influenced human events this way. Quietly, indirectly. A distant eruption affects harvests. Poor harvests raise bread prices. High bread prices fuel unrest. Unrest destabilizes governments. Civilizations change course. All because a mountain exploded somewhere far away, which makes history feel simultaneously interconnected and absurdly fragile. And perhaps no eruption demonstrates this fragility more dramatically than Toba in 1815. Yes, we mentioned it earlier. But Toba deserves another slow, sleepy visit because its effects were astonishingly global. The eruption released massive quantities of ash and sulfur into the atmosphere. Temperatures dropped worldwide. Harvest failures spread across Europe, North America, and Asia. People in New England saw snow during June. Imagine emotionally preparing for summer only to receive volcanic winter instead. Entire communities panicked. Crops failed repeatedly. Food shortages intensified migration westward in the United States. In Europe, starvation and disease spread through already exhausted populations recovering from the Napoleonic Wars. Because apparently the early 19th century felt humanity had become slightly too comfortable. The strange weather also transformed culture in subtle ways. Artists painted unusually dramatic sunsets caused by volcanic particles in the atmosphere. Writers described gloomy skies and endless rain. Again, we return to Mary Shelley and her creation of Frankenstein during this cold, miserable period. A volcanic eruption in Indonesia indirectly helping produce one of literature's great horror stories is exactly the kind of bizarre historical connection that makes historians stare thoughtfully out windows for long periods. Human civilization is deeply interconnected with natural systems whether people notice or not. And ancient civilizations noticed this far more clearly than modern societies often do. Farmers watched skies carefully. Priests tracked seasonal changes obsessively. Rulers feared eclipses, comets, droughts, earthquakes, and eruptions because environmental disruption threatened political order directly. Modern technology creates the illusion of separation from nature. But volcanoes still remind us the old relationship remains intact. Ash can still ground airplanes. Climate disruption still affects food systems. Entire populations still remain vulnerable to environmental instability. We are more advanced than ancient kingdoms, but perhaps not quite as independent from nature as we like imagining. And honestly, there is something oddly comforting about that too. Human beings are part of the same long, fragile story stretching back through every civilization we discuss tonight. The same skies, the same fears, the same uncertainty whenever the earth behaves strangely. Ancient kings stood beneath darkened suns wondering if their world was ending. Modern people refresh weather apps while pretending we feel fundamentally different. But deep down, we're still watching the horizon nervously whenever the ground starts shaking. A timeless human tradition. And unfortunately for future civilizations, the volcanoes are still there, quietly waiting beneath the surface, patient as ever.